In the year 1462, Hamza Pasha Çakırcıbaşı, a man who was serving as Senjak Bey of Nicopolis, was ordered by Fatih Sultan Mehmed, better known in the West as Mehmed the Conqueror, to try his best to achieve peace in Wallachia, modern-day southern Romania, with Prince Vlad Dracul III. Yeah, that guy. Hamza Pasha secures for this mission the help of his ethnically Greek secretary Katavolinos, who had not just been a very loyal servant to the Sultan and Hamza Pasha personally, but also had a long personal history with Vlad the Impaler and was a good connoisseur of the Christian and specifically Wallachian customs. Eventually, both Hamza Pasha and Katavolinos end up being impaled. Shocker, I know. But before that happens, Katavolinos proposes to Vlad Dracul III a way to achieve long-lasting peace at the southern border without having to pay zakat or tribute to the Ottoman Empire, nor having to tolerate Islamization. In return for this guarantee, Vlad Dracul had to allow the Ottoman forces to march across Wallachia from the Danube to the Carpathian Mountains. The Ottoman army was then to continue their march all the way to Buda and turn Hungary into a pashalik. Basically, to annex Hungary and make the place part of the worldwide Islamic Caliphate, which, by the way, actually happened, but later on and not in 1462. Vlad the Impaler knew that Mehmed the Conqueror would uphold his end of the bargain and not attempt any further to subjugate Wallachia. And Mehmed knew that Vlad knew as well. So everyone, well, kinda expected Vlad to take the deal, since he wasn't in particularly friendly relations with Hungary either. Yet Vlad the Impaler said no, and then impaled all the emissaries and waged war in the Ottoman territory in an offensive that shook the morale of the northern Ottoman army. While that offensive was taking place, he wrote a letter to Matthias Corvin, the half-Romanian king of Hungary, letting him know that he waged war on the Ottoman Empire and also explaining why. Was Vlad particularly willing to defend Hungary at all costs, including his own life? Nope. But what Vlad knew and expressed it was that while Mehmed would have indeed kept his word, he would have done so knowing that the successor likely won't. In Vlad the Impaler's words, the Ottoman Empire gives with the hand of the here and now, knowing full well that it will be able to take away a lot more with the hand of the century. What Vlad Țepeș was trying to explain to Matthias Corvin, and really anyone willing to listen, is that the Ottoman Empire understood its mission as one to be carried over the centuries and not one to be carried over in 1 or 2 decades or whatever short amount of time a sultan would survive. Now, why do I tell you this story? Well, it's because efficient political subversion works pretty much the same way. And this used to be acknowledged up front among both the left and the right 50 years ago. Today, well, some of the left still know this very well and practice it, while most on the right have not even heard about the concept, let alone practicing it. And that is kinda terrible. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so I told you a story from the Ottoman era to illustrate that what I'm about to describe and then suggest for us to adopt as a framework of thinking is not something that I came up with a few days ago, but rather a framework of thinking that has been around for at least 500 years. There are similar types of stories dating as far back as the Neo-Assyrian Empire 4 millennia ago, but the details of those stories are more scarce and disputed, so that's why I chose this rather recent one. Besides, who doesn't love a good Vlad Țepeș story, right? Anyway, thinking with the power of the century is something at which all factions of the modern politics used to be very good at, and by modern I mean in the Enlightenment era. The founding fathers of the United States, for instance, expressed this framework of thinking with the power of the century multiple times in their letters to each other. This can also be observed during the inner discussions of the Republican elite of the late 19th century Brazil, as the country was becoming, at least de jure, a republic. Similar thinking can be observed in early 15th century as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was consolidating. Marx wasn't particularly good at this, but his buddy, Friedrich Engels, was very good at thinking with the power of the century. And the thinking with the power of the century mindset can be clearly observed in Engels' work, The Origin of the Family, the Property and the State, in which he essentially makes the case for a gradual shift from mental sanity, which was prevalent in Engels' times, to mental disorder, which is prevalent now in early 21st century. It took about 150 years to get from there to now, but Engels knew for sure it can absolutely be done if leftists learn to think with the power of the century. And they did. For a while, up until roughly around the 1980s, the right was at the very least keeping up and was also engaged in this kind of thinking. The peak would be Ronald Reagan, who plowed through in his relentless policies aimed at taking down the communist empire for good, and did so despite early on failures and facing criticism every step of the way. One should remember that Reagan in 1982 was seen by the cathedral media and the bien-pensants of the time even worse than Donald Trump is seen right now. Ronald Reagan was, though, the last prominent non-leftist who both understood and practiced thinking with the power of the century. Since then, nobody really achieved anything, and nobody will, at least for another decade. But the early on signs are encouraging today if we do everything right and we understand this framework of thinking, and we're also a bit lucky. Yeah, I know, kind of tough stuff. Anyway, the most recent example of thinking with the power of the century that I can give you is the longest surviving member of the Frankfurt School, Mr. Herbert Marcuse. His 1950s essays are written in present tense, even though his ideas are the norm today and were far from being practiced by almost nobody in his days. What Marcuse knew, and almost nobody else noticed, was that although in mainstream politics his brand of far leftism was losing on every front, and although almost everything around him was essentially, by today's standards, socially conservative, his ideas had already won by 1968. And since then, it was only a matter of time until everyone would see the manifestations, everyone around them. Yuri Bezmenov was saying in 1980 that, look, you guys have already lost at least one generation. You'd better work on the next one. This one is already subverted. It's borked. It's game over. Try the next round. You can still win that one, but forget about this one. Both Marcuse and Bezmenov and Pacepa and Carvalho and any other thinker of either the left or the right who understood these things were explaining the practical manifestation of thinking with the power of the century. Unlike the times of the Ottoman era, or the Founding Fathers, or indeed even the times of Yuri Bezmenov, we have one advantage that none of these people had: the compression of time. And what I mean by that is the fact that debates and subversions that used to take between 80 years and over 1 century can now take as little as 1 decade. So unlike Mehmed the Conqueror, we no longer have to take away with the hand of the centuries, but indeed can realistically hope to achieve something within our lifetimes. This is neither good news or bad news. It simply is, because this applies both to the left and to the right, and really to any political faction that is interested in influencing the near future through agitprop and subversion. One other aspect to keep in mind is that while all of this is true, this is still not a guarantee of success. One such example is Soros Georgiou, who is also an influencer that practices thinking with the power of the century. Yet it doesn't seem to be working as planned for him. Now, we can surely debate the myriad of reasons for which Soros Georgiou's operation is no longer working as intended and has indeed recorded several, dare I say, retrogressions, but the reason I even give this as an example is to point out that incompetence, the opposition's sudden change of tactics, which happen faster than you can adapt to them, and indeed bad luck, are some of the causes for which an operation can fail even if it properly internalizes this framework of thinking. Now, one last aspect to keep in mind is, unsurprisingly, human nature. What I mean by this is that no matter what the political project is, it can only work if you can sell it in a way that is compatible with manifested human nature. Engels, for instance, had the instinct that it can be done, but was unsure about how it can be done. It needed another wave of far leftists, known in the US as the Progressive Era and in Europe as the early socialists, in order to get the answer to that second question. Translation: if you don't know how it's done, having the power of the century framework of thinking helps you keep focused on things that you do know, whilst maintaining the humility over the things that you don't know, and should thus be left to other people who do know, or indeed to the next generation. Alright, now what does that mean in practice for those in the politically activated non-leftist sector? Well, it means first and foremost to constantly remind ourselves that the fight for winning the next elections must come secondary, especially at this stage of the awakening. This is true for North America, but it is particularly true for most of Europe. If you're in a country or a jurisdiction where only 3 or 5% of the population thinks largely like us, the focus on trying to get a few seats in the parliament is a waste of time. It's not that it's an unachievable goal. Surely, in some jurisdictions, 5% can bring quite a few MP seats, but what would those accomplish over the span of 20 years? Well, not much really. That same energy should instead be invested in subverting institutions and creating new institutions, including and especially activist schools, which is something that I have just become deeply involved here in Romania, because I never advise others to do things that I haven't done myself. And in addition to that, cultural agitation must remain paramount. Now, back in 2008, when I started to be really aware of these things, it seemed like a pipe dream to be able to have millions of people worldwide publicly question feminism every step of the way. The idea of having a non-feminist content in the mainstream seemed like a pipe dream, like hell freezing over. Well, but hell did freeze over. And not only it became mainstream, but in just 8 years, from 2008 to 2016, we've gone from non-feminism being on the fringes to being part of the campaign trail for US presidency, with Donald Trump saying publicly that men get a worse deal, and then acting upon it, the Trump administration being by far the most non-feminist administration in recent history, all in spite of his not particularly wise wife, by the way. Anyway, that experience has been repeated on other issues, such as mass immigration, the European Union, and is now at the beginning, in the early stages, with the issue of free speech. This is, of course, a researcher mentality speaking here, as opposed to the doctor mentality. From a researcher perspective, the whole Patreon brouhaha, for instance, is the beginning of something whose results will be relevant 5 to 10 years from now. Until then, well, yeah, some things are bound to get nasty, because that's how change happens. That is why it's important, if you're a political operative, to be aware of the power of the century and not lose yourself into details. One example of losing oneself in the details is those individuals who spend a disproportionate amount of time dissecting the public words of some obscure figures who will likely never become relevant, like those who spend a lot of time arguing with autists on the internet. Why in the world would you even do that? Another practical application for this framework is in terms of morale, not to be confused with morality. The morale of the troops can be lifted or maintained at a higher level even if the troops understand that this is a grinding work where we expect the first tangible results in 5 to 8 years and the first substantive results in 15 or more. From that perspective, getting 15% in the election instead of the 40% one was dreaming about suddenly makes sense. I'll say this particularly bearing in mind the Swedish political operatives who had high hopes last time around, even though the culture was and still is not ready for that. Similarly, this should have been kept in mind by political operatives in France, especially those who supported Fillon or indeed Le Pen, although I'm allergic to Le Pen, more on that some other time. But the point is that the culture wasn't ready for someone hell-bent on shaking things up. It is ready now, though. So political operatives in France should up their game on agitation because 2021 is still far away, so the current momentum needs to be maintained. Again, keep in mind that centuries are decades now because of the speed of information. So 3 years used properly is at least 20 years in Engels' time or Thomas Jefferson's time. And finally, the last practical application for this framework is mental sanity for the activists themselves. This is something that I cannot stress enough. Because of the time compression phenomenon that I described earlier, being a political operative can drive you insane. And this does happen to those who stay in the trenches for too long. The abyss stares back, as it were, at some point, unless you understand your role and your long-term objectives. In plain English, thinking with the power of the century not only makes you a better suited political operative, but indeed makes you calmer, which in turn allows you to be more rational and have a more sound mind. Now, it doesn't mean you'll automatically become more rational, of course, but it does mean that you can get the opportunity to at least try to become more rational. Those who spend way too much time on Facebook, for instance, can see what happens to their rationality. And this is precisely because Facebook is, right now, a tool that makes sure you don't think long term. Now, of course, it doesn't always succeed, but it works with most people most of the time, and that's good enough. If your goal is to demoralize people. Now, I don't know if Facebook's goal is demoralization necessarily, but it sure does seem to be because the results kind of show it at this point. So, to sum it up, the world is unlikely to end tomorrow or in the next 5 years. Human beings are remarkably resilient for better or worse, usually for worse though. With that fact in mind, be sure to separate the rhetoric, which of course should remain harsh and with a sense of urgency, from attitude. You won't be able to do that in 1 day or in 10 days or in 100 days. It took me 4 years to learn it, but practice makes perfect. So, as a New Year's resolution, do try to think more with the power of the century. Over the long run, you'll notice that some topics really, and I mean really, do not matter. And make no mistake, the smart ones on the left already think like this. They may have lost their edge on this lately, which presents a tremendous opportunity for us, but the smart ones are still in business. That's what drives them to push for the exact same things, even if they lost several wars and multiple battles in a row on those exact same things. That's how you can get an Ocasio-Cortez to advocate Leninism even after Leninism was completely and utterly obliterated, not just intellectually, but also in war, in economics, and really in reality itself. It's because the smart ones on the left, those that groom the Ocasio-Cortezes of the world, can always bank on the opposition not thinking with the power of the century for long enough. And as I explained over 3 years ago, entropy is always on their side. We have to wake up every day to wash our car. We get the advantage of light they get the advantage of entropy. Which one wins over is to be decided every single time in every single instance. It's never forever decided. Now, for the newer subscribers for which this latest portion may sound like gobbledygook, I will politely direct you again to my October 2015 video called How Can Liberty Win? Spoiler alert, it can't, in the power of the century sense. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. I hope this video gives a slightly positive message, to the extent that I can give positive messages. Please do consider giving a shekel if you derive any value from the work being done here. Please do subscribe to my social media, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, everyone.